And good morning, everyone, or good evening, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Okay. All right, everyone. So those of you who are joining us, I just want to thank you for bringing yourself and dedicating your time and attention to this work this morning. We're really grateful to bring this learning opportunity to you all. And this is the first course of 4 that FiberShed will bring forward. I'm going to be your facilitator today, and my name is Rebecca Burgess, and I'm the Executive Director of FiberShed. And the presenters are all here, and we're also very grateful that we have an opportunity to work together today and share our different vantage points. So we've recently decided to open up this course to everyone who grows, mills, processes, designs, and wears textiles, which is basically everyone. We are going to take this time to collectively re-examine these systems of production and work together as a community of actors and learners and doers and makers to figure out what it's actually going to take to become capable of meeting the goals to address existential threats to all living beings, like this. Oops. Let's see here, if I can turn my screen. So the fashion industry, or the textile systems, after Poland and the IPCC agreements that were made there, the fashion industry put out a charter that it was going to meet climate action goals of a reduction of 30% of greenhouse gases by 2030 and net zero emissions by 2050. So this goal was placed prior to COVID-19. So we had at FiberShed assumed that we would create a webinar series just for brands, focused just on how to help meet these goals through the supply chain, connected to an agricultural system that could regenerate soil and draw down carbon. Since we've been designing this webinar series, the advent of COVID-19 shined a very bright light on the fissures between the growing, the processing, the branding, and the marketing sectors of this economy. And we are witnessing the impacts of a system that is completely dependent on a mode of production that places the lion's share of risk on the most vulnerable in the supply chain, the growers, the processors, and the makers. And we've seen that just in a few months of slowing this system down under the COVID-19 lockdown and shelter-in-place conditions, we've actually seen hundreds of thousands of textile workers, the lowest paid in the system, put completely at risk of starvation in many cases, and threats to their life. And so we ask ourselves, this is the risk. Here's an example of a quote: "Millions of your workers can hardly go days with no money and forget months. When orders that are ready to ship are canceled, you are crushing the factory. How do they pay for the fabric? How do they pay the workers? If fabric was imported, what about that factory and those workers? What about fabric that has been produced for orders that you no longer want? Most factories work on a month-to-month basis. If orders start to flow in June, many won't get paid until the fall. Most factories do not have the reserves to float workers and expenses for that time span. We must find a middle ground and a solution to get workers paid and a way to cover the cost of these raw materials." So Rubana Hook issued this statement on March 22nd, when $2.7 billion worth of orders from Western countries had not been paid for. So the question becomes, how do you meet your climate goals? Oops, sorry. Let's see here. How would you meet your climate goals when you can't hold the supply chain together in a human-induced shutdown that even lasts just a few months? So in this question of how do you meet climate goals is not just a question that I have, it's a question that the industry itself has. So the stagnation in the textile industry in terms of meeting environmental benchmarks has to do with ownership. Neither end of the supply chain has taken the reins in driving sustainable change. Manufacturers are waiting for brands to do it, and brands are waiting for manufacturers to do it. So how do we make those connections? So here we're going to spend some time talking about, today you'll learn about the carbon cycle and the power we have to harmonize with the carbon cycle, but you'll also hear about the we. What does the we need to do to work together to center our work in a way that is responsive and able to meet human needs? And how can we meet people on the ground where they are, supporting them in the work they need to do to regenerate soil, to regenerate systems of production. So we will explore conceptually some of this framing, and then we will actually meet two people managing farms, both in the United States and India. And we will discuss the potential to shift the risks so that we can more equitably work together to accomplish these goals. We have to look at risk, we have to look at who's carrying it, and we have to look at how we establish a more equitable set of relationships before we can meet any environmental goals. So I will stop sharing my screen, and I will introduce our first speaker who will discuss the carbon cycle with us. I'm very excited to introduce you to Dr. Jeff Creek. He's the co-founder of the Marine Carbon Project and a director at the Carbon Cycle Institute, where he provides senior leadership on carbon farming and land management. He brings 30 years of applied experience and theoretical training to the task of informing and facilitating the goals of the Marine Carbon Project. He is an agricultural and rangeland consultant, natural resource conservation service certified nutrient management planning specialist. He is the founding board member of the Alliance for Local Sustainable Agriculture, Belina Stinson Beach Compost Project, the Ag Director for Apple Tree International, and Dr. Creek holds a PhD in rangeland ecology and is a California State Certified Professional in Rangeland Management. So I will hand it over to Jeff to help us understand the carbon cycle and the intersection with working lands. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Rebecca. Lovely introduction. I'm really honored to be participating in this today. I'm going to share with you our work with carbon farming, and much of this has been in partnership with Fibershed. So I have to really acknowledge the fruitfulness of that partnership over the last many years. This work grew out of our concern with the climate change situation and the increasing rates of or levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. As I think probably everyone on this call knows, it's been about 3 million years since we had this much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And at that point, sea level was 20 meters higher and the climate was entirely different. Bill McKibben recently described the amount of heat we're pumping into the atmosphere every day as the equivalent of 400,000 Hiroshima bombs daily. It's kind of a stunning thing to think about. And despite all our best efforts with respect to international convenings to address this issue, starting in 1992 with the Rio Earth Summit, we really have failed utterly to address this problem. And even since the 2015 Paris Accord, we see a 4% increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide. This is kind of the situation. We have an 800,000 year record of ice core carbon dioxide content here. And you can see that essentially CO2 has been actually quite stable in the atmosphere, actually going back 3 million years, fluctuating between about 190 and 290 parts per million. We're currently at 416 parts per million and rising. We'll probably hit 418 by June of this year. In any other kind of system behavior, we would say this is a catastrophic system change. And indeed, as we all know, that's exactly what's happening. So what's the problem? The carbon cycle is this massive flow of carbon, long-term movement of carbon among various carbon pools on the planet, 5 major carbon pools essentially. And we, in our wisdom, have learned how to take deeply sequestered fossil carbon, combust it to drive the energy, drive our industrial modern civilizations. And of course, in the process, are pumping enormous quantities of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The oceans have done an amazingly good job of absorbing much of that CO2, about 90% of it, in fact, and about 90% of the heat that has resulted from that increasing greenhouse gas blanket of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But as we know, that increasing CO2 in the oceans, of course, is driving ocean acidification, as carbon dioxide in the oceans turns into carbonic acid. And we're seeing the collapse of marine ecosystems as a consequence of warming and acidifying. Many have turned to forests, hoping that planting of trees will mitigate some of this. The trees, of course, do absorb large quantities of CO2, and it's wonderful to plant trees, and we should do so wherever we can. But as those of us living in the western part of the country know, trees have a nasty habit of returning their CO2 to the atmosphere quite suddenly and quite catastrophically. And as conditions warm and dry in the West, we will see larger and larger fires and more biospheric CO2 leaving forests and going back into the atmosphere, which leaves us really with only one place to park this extra carbon dioxide, and that's in our soils. The soils are the second largest carbon pool on the planet. We tend to ignore it, and we don't tend to think about our soils that much, but the beauty of soils is that as we increase the carbon content of our soils, we see all kinds of positive things happening. Soil productivity increases, soil water holding capacity increases. So there are lots of good reasons and lots of benefits to increasing soil carbon. How do we do that? Well, we engage the power of photosynthesis, which quite simply is the transformation of solar radiation into biochemical energy. So plants do this amazing thing. They pull CO2 out of the air, combine it with water, and produce their own biomass. And in the process, discharge enormous quantities of their own photosynthate directly into the soil in what Christine Jones has called a liquid carbon pathway. And all of this driven by solar energy. So when plants discharge their sugars into the soil system, they fuel this incredibly diverse and bioactive region around the roots known as the rhizosphere. And the rhizosphere is where most of the action is happening in the soil system. In turn, of course, plants are receiving all kinds of goodies from bacteria and fungi. And sort of the archetypical relationship here is the relationship between mycorrhizal fungi and plant roots, which is an intimate association by which the plant provides the fungi with solar energy in the form of simple sugars. The fungi then expands its hyphal network and is able to supply the plant with water and nutrients that it otherwise could not access. And so this beautiful symbiosis has developed, of course, over many millions of years. Importantly, for the work we're all addressing today is the understanding that all of the carbon in the carbohydrates, which are the products of agriculture, originates from the atmosphere, not the soil. The plant is feeding the soil rather than the other way around. So Shramsky has described this as the Earth as a biochemical battery, whereby over the last 3 billion years or so, we have accumulated solar energy in the form of the Earth's, the planetary living systems, and have stored that both in those living systems and, of course, in fossil fuels. And we are engaged now in transforming that energy into heat, essentially driving that heat into the cosmos and depleting the Earth's store of stored energy. Now, if we follow this to its logical end, of course, we have a cold, dead planet. So while warming is our immediate concern, the long-range trajectory is equally dreary. Jansen points out that up to 90% of the solar energy invested in carbon by plants ends up in the soil. And it's there that that energy is then dispersed and dissipated throughout the food web, both in the soil food web and, of course, the larger biosphere as a whole. And so we can understand our relationship with soil as a relationship with the flow of energy from the sun throughout the biosphere. And Leopold expressed this quite nicely in his essay, his classic essay, The Land Ethic, in 1949, in which he defines soil fertility as the ability of soil to receive and store and release energy. As the IPCC pointed out in 2014, this anthropogenic climate change is simply irreversible at this point on any time scale that would make a difference to us, unless we're able to remove enormous amounts of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere over a sustained period of time. And as pointed out by the Institute for European Environmental Policy a couple of years ago, enhancing soil carbon is actually the only way to achieve negative emissions. My friend John Wick defines agriculture as the art of moving carbon between carbon pools to produce food, fuel, fiber, and flora. In other words, agriculture is exactly the tool we need at this important juncture. Now, this transformation from atmospheric CO2 to soil carbon can happen very quickly, and this is a 4-year chronosequence, if you will. The upper left, you see the original mineral soil in year 1 at about 1.5% organic matter. Year 3 on the right at about 3 or 4%, and then in year 4, we're at 6%. Now, this was done primarily through compost additions, but it also involved cover cropping and the elimination of tillage from the cropping system. This is a little vegetable operation up on the Mendocino coast. So understanding all of this, we've moved into a space we call carbon farming and carbon farm planning, whereby we take a whole farm view of the agricultural operation, and we ask the question, what are all the ways we might increase carbon capture on this working landscape? This is a particularly interesting case up in northeastern California, where we partnered with Fibershed on a project funded initially by a grant from North Face, which enabled the farm to develop this on-farm composting operation as a first step toward implementing their carbon farm plan. Out of that has emerged a whole line of climate beneficial materials and clothing in the North Face Cali wool collection through North Face, collaboration with the producer here, Lania Still. And what we found after completing her carbon farm plan and evaluating the greenhouse gas implications of wool production, we saw that the ranch had the opportunity to capture and sequester in soils and biomass 6 to 10 times its greenhouse gas emissions associated with its wool production. So we felt very confident we were stepping into a robust framework for talking about a climate beneficial agriculture. Now here's another example from the Marin Coast. It's the Stemple Creek Ranch. Lauren Poncha, producer of wool and lamb and beef. This is a 30-year photo series showing the carbon implications of a creek restoration project on the farm. And you can imagine how much carbon has accumulated in that riparian system over the last 30 years. But what's even more interesting in some ways is the impact on the biodiversity of the farm. And so you see what was essentially a denuded landscape at the beginning of the project is now supporting over 30 types of migratory birds nesting within that restored riparian system. So very significant quantities of carbon directly correlating with an increase in the capture of solar energy, therefore able to support increasing biodiversity on the landscape. Out of this, of course, has come the Cayuchi line of climate beneficial materials, partnering with Stemple Creek and Jensen Ranch, Jensen being a neighboring ranch also engaged in carbon farming practices. So what we're talking about here is the potential to counteract what we see as the unintentional anthropogenic forcing of atmospheric carbon with a very intentional anthropogenic forcing of soil organic carbon. And we know we have to do this at the global scale for this to work. What this graph shows, on the one hand, is the rising levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, but it also shows the intra-annual flux of carbon dioxide. And I've used last year's carbon dioxide numbers to show you this intra-annual flux. What you see here is the annual drawdown of CO2 from the atmosphere as the northern hemisphere forests leaf out in the spring and northern Pacific phytoplankton begins to draw down CO2 from the atmosphere. And it reaches a peak drawdown at about the fall of the year, at which point, of course, winter, fall arrive, and we begin to see the decomposition of much of that organic matter and its return via respiration of that carbon to the atmosphere. And then the subsequent spring arrives and we draw down another 6 parts per million or so. So you can imagine, given that this curve is currently rising due to our greenhouse gas emissions, that the need is to extend the drawdown just a little more. If we could extend the drawdown about 3 parts per million annually, we could begin to bend this curve. And so that's really the focus of the work we're talking about. How do we do it? Well, we put a whole bunch of people to work. And as we faced with the Dust Bowl crisis in the 1930s, we saw the emergence of a number of formal institutions, the Soil Conservation Service, the Resource Conservation Districts, and the Civilian Conservation Corps, all came out of that ecological catastrophe and were a very effective response. Now, all of these institutions still exist. They're miserably underfunded, but we anticipate that with a serious commitment of time and resources, we could actually achieve our drawdown goals through the existing infrastructure in the United States. So the good news is that we could do this, but we will have to seriously invest in our soils and our working lands as beneficial sinks for atmospheric carbon. And we really, obviously, we need to act now because we're running out of time. And with that, I will stop.
Thank you so much, Jeff. That was a very powerful and potent few 15 minutes. And we will have Q&A for Gopal and Jeff at the end of Gopal's presentation. So thank you. And I'm going to introduce Gopal before he begins. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Gopal. Gopal Dayaneni has been involved in fighting for social, economic, environmental, and racial justice through organizing and campaigning, teaching, writing, speaking, and involvements in direct action since the late 1980s. Gopal is an active trainer, and he serves on the board of the Ruckus Society, the Center for Story-Based Strategy. Gopal has been a campaigner for Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition on Human Rights and Environmental Justice in the high-tech industry, and an oil campaigner for Project Underground, a human and environmental rights org supporting communities resisting oil and mining exploitation around the world. He is the father of 2 young direct action junkies and lives in an intentional community with 9 adults, 8 kids, and a bunch of chickens. And I would say that I have been there, and I think it is a model for our future. And thank you, Gopal, for all of your involvement with FiberShed and supporting so much of the work at the meta level for all of us. And at the direct action level. You span such a gradient. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you very much for inviting me to be part of the panel. I am a big fan of Jeffrey's work, and I'm super excited to be in conversation together and with everybody else as well. I do have some slides to share, but before I do that, I'll just say a little bit more by way of quick introduction, and I will also start my timer. Yeah, I do live in an intentional community in Oakland, California, in unceded Ohlone territories along the Temescal Creek watershed, which has been paved and culverted, but is still, I like to remind myself, a living waterway. I do want to say that in this time of pandemic, I'm really reminded of how important it is that I've spent my entire adult life cultivating the practice of living in intentional community and being in relationship with people around me, and that have created the conditions with a host of other folks that is so much more resilient than if I had been, living by myself and isolated, or saw myself as made meaning of myself as an individual as opposed to as a part of a complex set of relationships. So I just wanted to say that. I did want to share a little bit about my personal connection to textiles and agriculture. I come from a family of peasant farmers in South India, in the state that's called Andhra Pradesh, along the Krishna River. My father is actually a rocket scientist, and I'm the first Indian on record born in Norway. And that story is actually the story of industrial agriculture. My father would have grown up as a farmer, just like his forefathers, and my mother would have grown up in the village too, just like her ancestors. But the massive influx of cash crops and chemicals from the Green Revolution shifted my family from growing food to mining for calories, and actually depleting the soil and extracting wealth. And that wealth was converted into cash, and that cash gave my father an education, and that education led my father to migrate to the West, and I grew up in the suburbs of Silicon Valley. And at the same time that process is happening, the reality in my community is that the soil is getting more and more depleted, that the toxicity is getting greater and greater, and that depletion can be tracked in the changes in my family's story over time, from being farmers to desperately trying to maximize yields, to ultimately depleted soil and shifting to aquaculture and pumping salt water into our fields in order to grow shrimp for export, to ultimately one of my cousin brothers sells soda pop at the bus stop, and my village is basically a bus stop now. And I've watched that happen over time. And that process is what has also been, the funnel of wealth and privilege to the West. So I am both the embodiment of the consequences of that process, and also feel a real connection to the relationship between those interacting and overlapping systems. So I'm going to share my screen and start my presentation, and I hope that folks can hear my what I'm sharing as kind of a complement to what Jeff is saying. It's like it's sort of like another layer of the same kind of analysis and understanding. So as we all know, we're facing a major ecological catastrophe, and I know everybody understands this, but just to put it succinctly, there was this incredibly powerful, extremely flexible, highly abundant resource that we extracted from its rightful place in living systems, concentrated control of it, and then unleashed it on the world. And that resource is at the heart of everything, from this webinar that we're having, to how we move around, to how we power our homes, to the table that my laptop is sitting on, to the clothing I'm wearing. And most of us are probably now thinking that resource that I'm talking about is fossil fuels. But actually, it's not fossil fuels. It's an entirely different pool of carbon. It's human labor and the labor of the rest of the living world. Because in order to extract fossil carbon, you first have to control human labor. To control this pool of carbon, you have to control this pool of carbon first. And it is actually the recognition that all wealth is generated through the work of the living world, and it is the exploitation of human labor that is then wielded like a chainsaw against the rest of the living world that is at the heart of the crisis that we are in. And if you don't actually assimilate that understanding, then the kinds of interventions we design will always miss the mark and always make the problem worse. We have to see ourselves, and we have to remind ourselves that we are the living world, and that recognizing our relationship to it is essential to any transformation, because you cannot wage war against the microbial life in the soil without first controlling the human labor to do it. You can't blow up mountains for coal unless you control the land and labor to do it first. And so that brings me to the first and most important point I want to make. And because somebody's going to say, can you say that again? I actually wrote it down on a slide. Which is social inequity is a form of ecological imbalance that will inherently result in ecological erosion. So ecology, eco means home, right? So an ecosystem is the relationships of home. So social inequity can be understood as an imbalance of our relationships of home. If we are not in right relationship with each other, we will never be able to be in right relationship with the rest of the living world. Which for me means that if you want to understand the climate crisis, it is insufficient to look up at the atmosphere and count carbon. You have to look down at the economy, at the exploitation of land, labor, and lifeways, and the erosion of seed and of soil and of stories. And I don't say this to say that the atmospheric concentrations of CO2 don't matter. I say this to say that you can, if you look up at the atmosphere and you think the problem is about is simply about concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere, you miss the fact that the strategic points of intervention is actually in how we manage home. It's in the economy. And as Jeffrey pointed out, one can lead you to reflect on your relationship to the other. And so that's the thing that we really want to get people to understand. Because if you don't, if you think that the scale of the problem will always dictate the scale of the solutions, then you do imagine that the way that you draw down carbon is through geoengineering or techno fixes, or that the way that we're going to get our needs met can be through processes that are not aligned with living systems, social equity, human rights, and maximizing the biological and cultural diversity on the planet. So with that, I want to share, and I keep wanting to make sure I don't lose my timing. So at Movement Generation Justice and Ecology Project, where I was a founding collective member in collaboration with Occidental Arts and Ecology Center, where I'm on the board, and a host of other social movement organizations and grassroots organizing, and along with Rebecca and folks at Fibershed, we've tried to create a framework for understanding the relationship between extractivism and an extractive economy and a regenerative economy or a living economy. And just briefly, I want to say, first, you can find all of this at the movementgeneration.org website, and there's a little booklet called From Banks and Tanks to Cooperation and Caring. But I want to make the point that all economy, all management of home can be understood in a very simple way. You take resources from the living world, you combine them with a particularly precious resource from the living world, which is our work, and towards some purpose. And then you have a culture, a cosmology, a worldview that makes it make sense to participate in. And you have a form of governance to facilitate its operation. To govern is literally to steer what? The economy, towards what? Its purpose. And in a classic case of form follows function, the form of governance will always be subordinate to the purpose of the economy. Whatever the purpose is will lead to whatever the form of governance needs to be to maintain it. And without getting into too much detail here, I'll say the purpose of the extractive economy, the dominant economy that we're in, is really the enclosure of wealth and power. And that's what we've seen. The constant ever expanding enclosures and the greater and greater inequitable distribution of the benefits of the wealth of the living world, including our own contributions to it. And there's a whole set of ideas that help maintain that. But all enclosures are inherently enforced through violence. And so ultimately, whether it's the fence around my house that's enforced by police or the border around a nation state that's enforced by an army, the notion of the enclosure demands a mechanism of enforcement, and ultimately that will be systematic and well-organized violence. And the economy we need, the economy we have to remember our way back into, is one in which the purpose is actually social and ecological well-being. So the purpose of the textile economy, by and large, is not to meet people's literally material needs. It is to maximize profit. The mechanism might be the production of textile, but the purpose is not to meet people's textile needs. But in a regenerative economy, the purpose is actually to meet people's textile needs in such a way that is sustained over time and resilient. And to do that, you have to have a different relationship to the living world, and you have to have a different relationship to human labor. And we think of that as cooperation and regeneration, right? Right now, we're using industrial throughput systems for the vast majority of production, and we exploit human labor to do it, versus organizing our work through cooperation and caring, and having a regenerative relationship to the rest of the living world, as Jeffrey pointed out. And I won't get into too much of the strategy here, and I'll encourage people to look it up. But I want to say something that's really, really important. And this is really important about everybody who's on this call. And I really appreciate that it's like across, it's like people who are producers and makers, people who are artists, people who are consumers, people who are farmers, everybody is in it together. And that is because the only way to build a regenerative economy is to actually live into it. And we have at the heart of our sense of how you do that is a principle that we say, which is what the hands do, the heart learns. That we actually have to apply our labor into living into the economy we want. Because if all we do is fight against what we don't want, we will learn to love the fight, and we'll have nothing left for our vision but longing, and longing isn't good enough. So while we do have to actually find strategies to divest both our labor and our capital from the extractive economy and invest it in a regenerative, in this case, textile and fiber economy, the only way to invest it is to actually live into it, to actually do it and apply it on the ground in real ways. And in so doing, we actually can be visionary and oppositional at the same time, which is actually kind of, in some ways, and to me, the very inspiring origin story of Fibershed is, the process of trying to live into what it would be like to have a local fiber economy forces a confrontation with the problematic systems that foreclose on that possible future. And so it's being visionary and oppositional, like living into the vision provokes the contradiction, or reveals the contradiction of and damage of the existing system. And of course, I like showing this one because it's like, oh, people already thought about what a regenerative economy looks like in textiles and garments, and that it is actually inclusive of all the different parts of the system. I actually was going to share a little bit about technology, but in the interest of time, I'll pause there, and then maybe when we have some discussion, we can talk about technology and false solutions. But if I could leave people with anything at all, it's that The only way that we will be able to draw down the carbon necessary through the soil is by drawing on on healthy regenerative relationships to each other, economically, socially, culturally, politically.
Thank you
And
both.
I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Gopal. I just, for those listening, Gopal and Jeff presented without really knowing that each other had both presented at a California College of the Arts course that I taught last year. And together they frame the really the analysis that I think helps us learn how to reapproach. If we're going to re-examine the systems, these are the frameworks that help us do that. And we hope for time on technology, Gopal, and erosive systems. For now, we're going to take 2 questions before we go into the farm manager and on the farm level. So 2 questions. I hope I can, 1 question for Gopal and 1 question from Jeff from the audience. So if folks would like to type in, and Marisol, maybe you, could help me if I'm not seeing where these questions are.
Will do.
Let's see, I've opened up. So I have one from I think it's, chat. Oh, yep. So Jeff, if you want to turn your video back on. I think we have 1 question from Jeannie. Can I interact here to say that these graphs blow my mind? Very clear imagery of the sickness of the Western mindset and the nourishing spaces we need to create. We can share this recording with you all. It will be resent out to everyone who is listening. So those graphs will be available. And then Gopal, you mentioned those graphs are available on the website for, is it movement generation or?
Yeah, you can find, there's a little booklet that you can download for movement generation. It's movementgeneration.org. I'm also happy to share my presentation.
Okay. Whitney, Whitney, hello. Whitney is a wonderful journalist from New York and thinker, and she has just asked Gopal, when we talk about meeting people's textile needs, is there also room for textiles contributing to beauty, pleasure beyond the utilitarian? And how do we think about that when pleasure is often used as an excuse to overextend resources? Great question.
Yeah, that is a great question. Let's see. First of all, I consider beauty and pleasure a need. So, I personally am not one of those people who's like, our needs are limited to whatever sort of notions of, the very basic needs. I think there's actually a lot more, like belonging is a need, for example. And cultures have found there are many diverse ways in which we represent belonging. And in fact, textiles, just like food, have been integrated into those cultural practices for millennia. So, textile is representative of the cultures we are in. We happen to be in a culture of racialized monopoly, capitalism, radical individualism, settler colonialism, patriarchy. And so our textiles reflect that. And the way we reimagine textiles is an intervention, not just into the material space, but into the cultural space and the psychic space. And so, we absolutely, there are diverse textile cultures, even within the context of Western settler colonial logics. Like there's a rebellious textile culture, right? Everything from the kind of vision of Fiber Shed around integrating local economies with living systems and right relationships to each other as a way of meeting our textile needs, to folks who are intervening in textile culture by elevating reuse as a form of fashion, to, there's a whole host of ways in which that's happening. When the primary purpose is to use textiles in whatever part of the process as a mechanism for extracting wealth and concentrating control of it, then you are actually subordinating the beauty to profit. And that, in my opinion, is ugly. So that's the thing. And we all experience that, right? You might see something that's high fashion on a runway. Is that what it's called when you watch models? And you're like kind of repulsed by it. You're not repulsed because you have an opinion about the textile. You're repulsed because it represents a social process that you find deeply offensive. And that, textile, like everything else, like food, is a window into that world. So embrace that. Yeah, the beauty is essential. Sorry, that was an over
that's great.
Over answer.
You go Paul. Thank you. There's a couple of questions. We're gonna have one for Jeff, and then Jeff, maybe just like 1 minute on this one, and it kind of ties to, and you might be muted, Jeff. Ties to policy, I think. So Nicholas asks, how do we make end products of climate beneficial fibers accessible to working class folks who can't afford a $300 blanket? And I can just speak to that real quick and say, a lot of this is the centralization of the manufacturing systems, Nicholas, that if we were to have decentralized manufacturing, we could move local materials through the right kinds of equipment, appropriate technologies that allow us to bring prices way down. But when you have to ship your local fibers to these centralized units, it becomes very costly. In fact, the commodification of the economy has actually made things that used to be cheap. Eating local would naturally be a cheaper option than importing things from overseas. It's the first time in history, really, human history, where importation of goods has become a cheaper way to get your needs met than working in your local community. We're kind of turned the economy around in ways which is not beneficial, obviously, to our ability to have endemic textile culture, but it's not impossible by any stretch of the imagination to create working class or affordable clothing. Jeff, do you have anything to add on the policy or the climate side, how to make this work?
Well, I would defer to Gopal in the sense that, we might ask the question, how is it that it is too expensive to afford a blanket? Why do we have a whole group of people, the majority on the planet, for whom buying a locally made blanket would be prohibitively expensive? So I think Gopal touches on the root causes of all of that very nicely.
Thank you, Jeff. We're going to have question and answer hopefully at the end as well. And those of you who've asked your questions, that we have all noted them, and we will actually do some response. I think Marisol's telling me we can post answers later on. We'll figure this out to get all your questions answered. And in the the transition we're going to make here now is to engage at the farm level. So I'm going to introduce Nishant Chopra. He is the founder of Oshadi Collection, a company focused on reviving India's textile heritage. He works with communities of natural dyers, hand weavers, and those involved in cut and sew. He is the founder of the Prakriti Fiber Shed, and he has undertaken, starting last year, a demonstration-focused organic and regenerative cotton farm that is taking the added steps of regenerating farmland that had been farmed conventionally. He and his team, including an older female farm manager who holds traditional knowledge, have been re-inspiring and reweaving the tapestry of traditional Indian agriculture with historic textile making practice. As the next generation of textile makers, he is bringing back the most salient aspects of the past to offer a healing balm to the future of fashion. His 5-acre demo site has a goal of growing to 200 acres for a practice that would scale regenerative organic agriculture in his community. And we're going to both hear from Nishant an introduction about Oshadi Collection, and then we do have a small technologically rough but still potent video of Nishant on farm that we will show. So Nishant, I'm going to bring up those slides we talked about right now. And
thank you for having me, Rebecca. It's a pleasure to be on here with you and other amazing speakers. I would like to start by how we launched in 2016. We started as a contemporary women's wear and textile brand with an aim to create a tight-knit village economy where we bring together the weavers, the artisans, the farmers, and create this kind of community where everything is interconnected. And yeah, where we started with the weaving, the fashion brand first, and we moved on to the weaving. We found out what was wrong with the systems of with the weavers getting inconsistent orders. And we also looked into the sewing, because sewing also had these the problems, the issues of inconsistent orders depending on the market fluctuations of the retail industry. And then we went a step further towards the fibers and the dyes, and we realized a lot of those fibers were not grown ethically with environment and social issues in mind. And then we moved towards the dyes. And every time we looked towards an issue, we found a solution in the traditional Indian farming, traditional Indian weaving, traditional Indian textile practices, which as Jeff and Gopal before introduced, to like how the Green Revolution and a lot of those other things have created such social hindrances and environmental issues. And we sort of moved from we started looking into these natural dyes, which have been like around for like years and years, like for generations. And we worked with the local farmers, and every information we got was through word of mouth on what the social practices, what the right social practices are, what the right environmental practices are. And we started implying, I started putting it together, and I heard, of course, like one of the podcasts where Rebecca was on, and then I realized, oh, this was called regenerative farming, and I got in touch with Fibershed to see if they can somehow support what we were doing here with all these kind of traditional techniques and farming practices, weaving practices. And with support from Fibershed, we were introduced to Christy Dawn, who were our first brand partners and who came on board in August, I think about last year. And we decided to together we decided to work on this 5-acre barren land and transform it into a completely regenerative farm. Regenerative not just in terms of the cotton we use on the farm or the materials, but in terms of the environment, the social things where everyone's being paid fairly throughout the supply chain. And before we moved to like a really big farmland, we decided we were going to do like a small acreage of land. And as you can see, these are some of the people, the farmers who've been working. As you can see in the slides, the Ishwari is a woman, is a farmer who kind of guides us through the herbs, the weeds, which are which are considered weeds, are actually not weeds, but something you can put back in compost and actually a real resource for the farm. And we built a small team with Vaishali, who brings in her education in agriculture and horticulture, and a farmer who bring their traditional knowledge. And it was a tandem of those, and with and it was partnership of Christy Dawn, and we started with a barren land. It converted to a cotton farm, organic cotton, regenerative cotton, and now it's come full circle. Where you can see, like on the left side, you can see this image of the first cotton growth in the farm on the barren land. I think I can share the image after of how it was before we started, but the image on the left is a cotton where the first cotton growth, and the image on the right with the goats is the cotton farm coming full circle yesterday with the goats grazing on the cotton biomass and converting the biomass into the compost through their manure. And yeah, we successfully got the yield we expected. And yeah, we are working on the next 30 acres, and we have aimed to start 200 acres, hopefully end of this year if things are okay, things get better with the corona situation, or perhaps early next year.
Wonderful. Is this a good time? Can we show the video of the farm so people can get?
Oh yes, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
Marisol, do you want to share the video of the farm? So just so everyone knows, as this is launching, the reception was, internet reception was not very strong. So there's, the technology is not smooth, but I think in the interest of getting to know each other and familiarizing ourselves, we can be informal and recognize the jewels in this video, regardless of the technology. Are able to figure out volume.
Just like a 2-minute walk. So
Perfect.
I usually don't live here. It's since lockdown I started living here because you're only allowed to work within the community. No one from other localities are allowed to move around, so you can't go around in vehicles. You can't transit. I think it's just like wherever you can walk to is where you can work. You know, and you usually can only walk within your locality because India is so big. Yeah, so I decided the day they announced it was a lockdown, I decided to move to quite close to the farm because it's something, you know, you need to give complete attention to. It's a big piece of land, like 21 acres, and big piece to compare to what we did last time, which was like 5 acres. Of course, like there are much bigger farming regenerative projects around the world, but yeah, it's still like one of our biggest projects to date. And I thought it's good to live near the farm, learn what the farmers, you know, think like how the soil works. It's really important to be quite close to the farm to understand like different characteristics of soil, plants, even the people you work with. And yeah, lockdown has kind of given us a slight advantage because I don't have like, you know, we don't have other textile works to focus on. So our complete attention is just towards the farm. We have like different drums for different kind of compost teas, which we are going to make for the farm through this 6-month period of time for the first cotton produced. So we've just started with the first compost tea, which is here, you know, maybe I can show it to you how it works here.
Oh, what's in there?
So the compost tea is a very traditional way of creating like essential bacteria, like a rich food for like earthworms. So, you know, as you put it in the soil, the earthworms which are down below, they come up, and it's made with green gram flour, jaggery or brown sugar, or, you know, you could use even sugarcane syrup. And then you put in cow dung and cow urine, and then you put in, of course, like loads of water. And, you know, you have to keep stirring it and make sure there's no air contact. So you leave it in there for like 5 days, and then it becomes this really surprisingly like really good smelling, like really sweet smelling in like 5 days. Because when you first put it, it's a lot of cow dung and urine, and you wouldn't expect this, but in 5 days, it starts becoming kind of delicious. I haven't tasted it though. But the new piece of land which we've leased, it has like about 40 different kinds of trees. So here, I can show you, this is like a sapota tree. I don't know if you guys have it here. It's kind of a plum. It's like a brown, super sweet, tasty kind of plum. I've never seen it in Europe or anywhere else, but it's absolutely delicious. And it's like the summer, it fruits like twice a year. But so this is already like, you know, people who ran this farm, they probably didn't have an idea that if you don't disturb it, it creates its own natural ecosystem. And when we leased it, we realized this farm has been untouched for like 10 years. Like this side of the farm where the trees are, no one's like maintained it. So you can see like the leaves are automatically falling down. There's like, you know, all the land is like covered with leaves. So there's no water evaporation. And of course, you know, when there's like loads of carbon, and when there's a lot of carbon, there's like a lot of water retention capacity. for this piece of land, we just like water once in 15 days.
Wow.
Compared to like other pieces of land where we need to water every third day, because there's no this constant availability of water below. Even I think like if we sort of dig it, it's still like the last time we probably like watered it was like ages ago, probably like 20 days or something, because we are currently watering cotton, and you can still see it's a bit moist, just like 2 inches below the thing, right?
Nice.
And yeah, so we don't think we have to maintain this farm. In return, like this farm gives us a lot of compost. So we are using, I can show you the wormy bed, which we are making. So we use all the green waste from the farm, like all the leaves which are excess, the coconut husks. You see that loads of coconut trees around here.
Yeah.
So we're using it creates this wormy casting. I'm sure you know about this,
Oh, that's beautiful.
which is really rich in like potassium, I guess, calcium, magnesium, and we also collect the water. As you see, like we have like a pipeline coming in, and it just comes into this wormy water. And this is like super rich in all those things as well, which I just mentioned about the vermicastings. And I think this is one of our main sort of ingredients and I can show you what we do with this compost tea is we pour it in the tank, this tank. So we created this tank where we pour all the compost tea, and then we've installed like drip irrigation all throughout. So what we do with the drip irrigation is we have something called venturing, where we take all these compost teas, different kind of compost teas, and then you shove the venturing, and it mixes with the water when you water the plants through drip irrigation.
Oh my gosh.
For such a long time. So it needs to be confident that it can be safe upwards, it can get its food, constantly. So yeah, so we did this compost spreading, and then we started giving compost tea after a week, probably like tomorrow, because it's been a week since we've sowed the cotton and other crops. And you have so many different varieties of crops on one field this time. The last time we did, I think we just had like 3 and a lot of wheat plants, 3 different kinds of wheat plants. But this time we have about like 15 different kinds of.
Wow. What are the crops?
It's cotton, of course. That's like the main crop. And then we have maize, we have sorghum, we have green gram, black gram. There are some Tamil names I don't even know how. I don't know what it's called in English, but they're like ulundu, tattapairu. I don't know. It's also this marigold, sunflower. We have castor. And we are hoping to have some vegetables, cilantro, things which can harvest like way before the cotton does. Because when you harvest cotton, it shouldn't be like an hindrance to the cotton. You have to make sure like the other harvests are at least half the time before the cotton. So sorghum is made for like the birds. A lot of birds. I mean, I wouldn't say they are pests, but it's their ecosystem which we've been a pest to, right? And you make sure they get their food so they don't feed on the cotton. So you create like a food for them. And when you have a lot left over, you can feed it to the cows. I can show you the cow shed. One sec.
Yeah, please.
So a lot of the compost, when we did the first organic cotton farm, about like 15 tons of compost, about 30 tons of compost were used from this farm. And we are just making this new thing because, we are hoping to start like maybe 100 or 200 acres of regenerative farming towards the end of the year. So we have already started making the compost heaps for that. So you can see these women help us natural pest control. But then when you take the oil, there's like a leftover husk or whatever it is. Like after you extract the oil, there's leftover waste. And then what you do with the waste is you bring back to the cow dung and then you put it in. And it's one of the best like pest control or composting farming manual says is that we have to use like traditional cows, which are called desi cows here, because the cow dung is way more, the cow dung is, why we use cow dung is essentially, and it's really important to use the indigenous varieties of cows for the cow dung and urine. Of course, like not all these indigenous varieties, because and friends close by, but a lot of the milk is used for composting because we make like ghee. Ghee is like unsound from like the cows, and it uses cow urine, it uses cow dung, it uses cow urine, cow buttermilk, ghee, and these are like 5 different things we get from like milk or cows. So you make it in, you make like a compost tea, you leave it for 5 days, keep stirring it, and then it also starts becoming, it says hi. And some of the native varieties of pulses, they're kind of like creepers. I wouldn't say exactly like creepers, but they don't go like that long, but just like around 3 or 4 feet. And what it does is when they grow, it would sort of create like a surface where there's no direct sunlight hitting the soil.
Mm-hmm.
And which is quite good because then you end up saving water and there's no evaporation. It's always like soil is always moist. As you saw there, we only use plastic where we need to collect like wormy wash, which is the water. Yeah. But this is like completely natural. There's no plastic. It's built with like it was built like ages ago, I'd say 50 years ago. So you see there's so many. It's a place where all the pigeons sort of, you feed the food onto this top. You see the door here.
Oh, yes.
So you put the food in that, and then you create these small blocks where the pigeons live. Oh, one second. Not sure if you can see, but you see the blocks?
Okay. And they live in there? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they live in there. And when they live in there, when you give the food, all the pigeon cats are collected in this.
Oh, clever. So clever.
Yeah, so you don't want it to be anywhere near the land, like the flat surface, because then you have cats and snakes attacking the pigeons. So I realized the reason they built it so high up back in the day is because they didn't want the pigeons to be attacked by cats and snakes. And then you can figure out how much compost you want to add to the water by working that out.
That is so.
I think this is about it. I just wanted to let you know that even though, like, I forgot to mention that even the pest controls, right? With the natural pest controls here, you don't spray it when the pest attacks. You spray it like all the time. Because if you don't spray it, like, you spray it just even when the thing is healthy, because you don't want like anything to be infected beforehand, right? So with the natural things, you have to do continuously, like whatever you do, like what kind of pests or the pest controls or the composties, it's got to be like at regular intervals, no matter like if you have pests in the farm or if the reason we had to make these wormy beds or wormy composters because like we've disturbed the already existing layers, the ecosystem below the soil. And through this, we are looking to regenerate it back or things like that. But I think it's just a matter of like 3 to 5 years. And after that, like the land starts to manage itself. You don't need to sort of like, come in and do all these things. So once you have like earthworms on the top layer of soil.
This is how you regenerate with the cows, with the neem leaf, with the making the wormy compost, applying it. But over time, the land will sustain on its
Yes, I think so. Like also you create this ecosystem beneath the soil. We've disturbed the ecosystem, like let's say if you disturb something above the soil, you can create, like, you see a direct impact of things. The only thing is when there's something beneath the soil, humans can't see because they're considered so small, to value it. But
I think what essentially all these things are doing is creating like this natural ecosystem which existed like all the time, like, ages ago, the essential bacteria, the mycelia network, the fungi, like all of those things come back to the normal. And once they are back, you don't really have to like feed it, or, you don't really have to like imply it or apply it to the land. And that's exactly what regenerative farming is. You come to this place, you come to this state where you don't have to buy anything. You don't have to, it's got to be a completely zero budget farm where you don't have to buy anything anymore. And the farm itself becomes so self-sufficient that it kind of starts helping you out. You don't need to help it anymore. Probably you're not helping it. You're just restoring what existed before. But then once you have this farm, you don't have to like
Thank you, Nishant, for your brilliant work jumping from textile design and development into agriculture, and for honoring the traditional practices and bringing older farmers into your work. And so before we go to Sarah, because I know we're tight on time, I just wanted to ask you 2 questions. There are a lot of questions for you in the chat, and I'm going to bring those up at the end. So all those who have questions for Nishant will get there. But I just want to make sure, because today is about the mechanisms for how we regenerate. Can you share just briefly the brand partner that supported you to help catalyze at the farm level? You grew Oshadi to the farm level, and you were able to speed up your process of regeneration. And then can you say who that brand was and how that was helpful? And then could you also put the word out to other brands who are here today? Could you say how you would like to see other brands get involved? What are the key actions we need to expand this traditional agriculture model?
The key actions I would say is the brand's involvement right from the beginning, because currently, like how the system works is the entire burden falls upon the cotton farmers. If there's no demand, like the cotton farmers are stuck with the cotton, and everything they grow is based on the loan they get, and they have to pay it back right away, which they can't if the cotton is not bought at certain rate. And like the commodity market starts deciding like, hey, the cotton's price is going to be lower because there's less demand, or it's going to go high. But those are the wrong factors. I believe that which should decide like what the price of a fabric should be, or what the price of the cotton should be. It should be considered like, as every single thing is interconnected, right from like the soil to all the way up to the brands. But the current situation is where how like the other brands, like what they basically do is they just rely upon the order. They place an order to a factory, and then the factory decides to spin it, probably weave it, spin it. And when it goes all the way back to the farmers, it's completely, the entire burden goes to the farmer, because, if a factory decides not to weave something, it's the farmer who's accumulated so much cotton working at this, in the farm from like 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. every day, such hard toiling. That's why you see so many, such a high suicide rates among farmers in India, because, they are stuck in this vicious circle of this current textile supply chain, which is not right, like, both environmentally and socially. And that's why brand partners, that's why I think, sorry, I lost you for a second. Am I audible now?
So brand partners get involved at the beginning. So Christy.
Yeah, that's why the brand, like Christy Dawn, they came in, they believed in us, and, all the research we did, and, they decided to join, share the risk, and which normally a lot of brands won't do so, and I think that's the right way of looking at the supply chain, where, everything is interconnected. Basically, the humans, as we see, everyone, has this mentality that, hey, we can go alone, and, we are exceptional, and we can do things, by ourselves. But as you can see, that kind of mentality for the past decade or past centuries, like, it's not produced right results. You can see, like Jeff talking about all the environmental impacts it's had, and Gopal speaking about like all the social impact it has had on people. And people don't realize that 1% of the population way up there, the 99% of the population sort of works so the 1% can have what they want, or what they would like to, or what they would want to do, and the rest, like, is such a big population, and they're a brand in US or brand in like Europe, they don't know, like, there are hundreds of people working, there are like 50 farmers working on one farm, and there's so many people working in the spinning, ginning, every step of the thing, to make sure the dress looks like what it looks like when it comes to London, or when it comes to LA. I think it's really important for everyone to understand that everything is interconnected, and just to value that, and go back to this old way of doing things as a community, not just when it comes to like the textile side of things, and making side of things, but even towards the brands, when they come together, what we could create is have inputs, and such creative minds from such amazing companies come together, and facilitate this a new model, a new textile, a new outlook of looking at the textile supply chain, and creating it from grounds up.
Thank you, Nishant. Thank you. A new vision for a textile supply chain based on relationships and brands getting involved early on at the farm level to help regenerate ecosystems. That's our takeaway. Thank you. We're going to move to Sarah Bellows now. Thank you, Nishant. We'll go to Q&A at the end if we have some extra time. I'm going to introduce another farm level manager. Thank you, Nishant.
Thank you for having me, Rebecca.
Our pleasure. Oh my gosh, gift and an honor. Sarah Bellows is the CEO and founder of Stony Creek Colors. She has been working with indigo and natural dyes since 2006, having previously managed a textile dye house offering garment and piece dyeing with plant-based color. A graduate of Cornell University School of Agriculture with a degree in natural resource management, she has managed small farms and worked across the food and agriculture sector. Sarah developed Stony Creek Colors to build a new future for natural color, harnessing advancements in sustainable agriculture, crop development, chemical and process engineering, and she has been recognized as a leader in bio-based colorant production to farmers in the Southeast United States, awarded the Young Entrepreneur Award by the American Association of Textile Colorists, and she was the Tennessee feature of Fast Company Magazine's United States Innovation Award in 2017. She's a very accomplished agrarian and business owner, and has been a colleague and a dear person in solidarity around indigo in the United States. Thank you for joining us, Sarah.
Yeah, pleasure to be here, and thanks to Rebecca and the rest of the Fibershed group for convening us today with such a great group of speakers. Hopefully I have something constructive to add to the conversation. I'm going to share some slides, and I have a somewhat spotty internet connection today. It just rained. And so in case things go haywire, I'm going to call in via video or via my phone, and then hopefully Marisol can share the slides just in case something goes wrong. So to just get started though, I am bringing this up because it was just there. I first really heard about plant-based indigo in the years following my undergraduate degree at Cornell. I actually had the chance to run a small farm. Are you seeing my slides right now? Okay, great. To be a part of a group running an urban farm in Nashville, and really getting connected more to the local agricultural economy. At the same time, as Rebecca mentioned, I was running an artisan-based business with my two sisters. We were using natural dyes to dye, starting with like our own designs and shirts for stores like Whole Foods and boutiques, and then eventually evolving into bringing in fabric from other designers and small brands and dyeing it with plant-based color. And really from that experience, I saw a lot of the inconsistency and the lack of traceability in the natural colorants that we were purchasing. I kind of took the opportunity to look at what I wanted to accomplish in my life and realized that running a service dye house was really fascinating. This is a really beautiful artisan business, but I really felt like the things that were required for that to be a very vibrant and profitable business were not really available yet in the marketplace, and especially as it relates to natural colors. So I'll touch on that a little bit further on. But when you hear about indigo, a lot of people, even brands today, are using phrases like dyed with real indigo, and all that really means is that it has a certain molecular structure, as shown on the screen. Everywhere where you see a point of a hexagon or a pentagon and there's no letter, that is the chemical reference for a carbon. And so we're really here today to talk about carbon. And if you think about indigo and pretty much every other thing that we deal with on a daily basis, besides inorganics, is built around carbon. And so indigo is not unlike polyester fabric versus cotton fabric. They all in some way are relying on this carbon economy that we are living in, no matter what, whether we're choosing to or not, just by the products that we are accessing and purchasing and supporting. And so real indigo could mean natural or synthetic indigo. And so if you buy something with indigo today, for the most part, it's going to be dyed with synthetic indigo. So what does that really mean? I'm just going to run through this super quickly because I want to really focus on the farming side of what Stony Creek is doing. But ultimately, the indigo that is being used by all denim brands for the most part today, and really the majority of dyers around the world still, even artisan dyers, is synthetic indigo. That's made from chemistries like benzene and cyanide. Over 90% is coming out of a small handful of factories in China, over 50% from a single factory in Inner Mongolia. And the last synthetic indigo made in the US was actually that factory closed down in 2020. So synthetic indigo follows really a very traditional chemical synthesis process in the sense that it's extremely linear. It starts with benzene, which is derived from petroleum. So we're really extracting resources from the core of the earth. As Gopal mentioned, there are, it's not just about pulling carbon out of the Earth's core, right, and turning that into more kind of readily accessible carbon. It's also about really the exploitation of people that like allow coal and petroleum to be so cheap today relative to its real kind of both social and environmental costs. So that kind of basic building block of indigo is combined with chemistries like formaldehyde, cyanide, ammonia. It's actually over a half a pound of cyanide required to make 1 pound of indigo. I think that Rebecca will be able to share these slides, so I won't spend a ton of time on the chemistries themselves, but in the example of sodium cyanide, for example, it is 0.52 pounds of cyanide at kind of minimum, which is a very toxic poison, as many of you know, to make just 1 pound of synthetic indigo. So we're really talking about a huge number of chemistries to make a useful product in our lives today. Since I'm here to talk to you about plant-based indigo, you can probably assume that I have a different perspective on how we should be making the same exact chemical from a totally different pathway. And that is by growing plants that naturally contain precursors to the indigo molecule and growing them in a way that is really considerate and emphasizing circularity and how we can regenerate and really produce renewable chemicals as opposed to the extractive petroleum-based chemicals. And so what I'm going to walk us through today is really how Stony Creek has really like a microcosm, I guess, of how we have attempted to create this more circular value chain that still brings a high purity product into the marketplace for denim mills, but does not have the negative environmental and social impacts of the synthetic indigo used today. So we start as a company really all the way with the seeds and the plants. We contract directly with farmers to grow the crop, and then we run our own manufacturing facility where we produce the high purity plant-based indigo dye in Tennessee. Right now we're working with farmers in Tennessee and Kentucky and selling to makers and denim mills really around the world, but a pretty small subset of mills and brands right now that are using our products. That ultimately lets consumers start to choose a plant-based indigo instead of the synthetic real indigo that might be used today. So when I say that we're producing natural indigo at scale, I have that in quotes because while we think that probably we're producing in terms of purity and volume the highest amount of indigo, it's still really an extremely small amount. The vast majority, like I would say over 99.999% of indigo used today is synthetic indigo. And in a little bit, maybe I'll touch on how even a lot of the quote natural indigo being used today is still synthetic indigo. But to focus just first on the farmers and kind of how we have set about to make this work for Stony Creek Colors and what we've been investing in. It really does start all the way before the plant. So we've been looking at indigo as somewhat of an orphan crop. We grow 3 different varieties of the indigo to bring up more diversity into our cropping systems, and are focused on selecting not just for indigo concentration or biomass, but a range of parameters that will let us build a really resilient crop for the future. For our growers, the company does the production of the seed and or the transplants for the farmers themselves, and we've developed a system to harvest the plant mechanically and pretty quickly. That lets us get into the field early enough in the season to get multiple cuttings from the same acre planted. As you mentioned, Stony Creek runs our own extraction process, and that is a totally water-based or aqueous extraction process. We don't use any organic solvents or other extraction kind of media besides water. And in our team right now is kind of both operators at the factory and the agricultural level, as well as chemists and plant scientists that really allow us to build what we see as this new future for indigo manufacturing. And one of the reasons that we're doing that is really because what we see in the United States and really around the world is that farmers are growing the same commodity crops, cash crops, and for the most part, they're part of a really larger scale macroeconomic environment that they don't have much control over. And so we set about to focus on a crop that could be an alternative and a rotation crop for these farmers that would provide some other really ecosystem services for their soil and for their kind of farm financial health as well. And so there are a couple of reasons why we're focused on the varieties and the plants that we are that make it an easy choice for them. I'll have a slide kind of summarizing some of the what we see as the environmental benefits, but one unique attribute of 2 of the varieties that our farmers are growing is that they're legumes. This means that they're plants in the bean family that actually are capable of sequestering nitrogen out of the atmosphere. The atmosphere is about, kind of lower atmosphere is about 72% nitrogen. And for anyone kind of involved in agriculture, you know that nitrogen is a huge fertilizer used by farmers today, and it's a huge source of water pollution in watersheds across the world. We're in the Mississippi River Basin where I am in Tennessee, and the whole dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico is really caused by nitrogen fertilizer runoff, both from households, but predominantly from industrial agriculture. So the little circles on the roots are part of this symbiotic relationship Jeff mentioned earlier in his presentation between kind of the rhizosphere, the roots hosting bacteria that can allow this nitrogen to be turned from atmospheric nitrogen into a usable form of nitrogen for this plant. And the benefit of our harvesting system is that nitrogen is also then some percentage of that is stored in the roots and the stem that get reincorporated into the field at the end of the year, as well as in the leaves, and then go into the composting process. So Stony Creek Colors, our business model is really right now one in which we contract with farmers in our region. They're all, for the most part, former or current tobacco farmers who are farming conventionally. This was our real choice, even though I kind of came up in agriculture through smaller scale farming. We wanted to look at how do we make some system change on broadacre farms. I don't want to just convert my friends that are growing 5 acres of organic tomatoes into a rotation crop. In fact, they're all doing a great job of rotating already. I want to look at how we can rotate farmers out of the larger commodity crops that are not adding health to their soil, and instead diversify those farms and really improve the soils at their farm level. So Stony Creek is paying a guaranteed price per acre to these farmers. We contract in the beginning of the season so they know what they're going to make and can budget appropriately. As I mentioned, we provide the seed and or the transplants directly to them, so really lowering their kind of early season investment. And also we are currently providing all the harvesting service, I guess I would call it. And so that's very much for us an important part of lowering the barriers to entry for farmers to be able to get into growing indigo, because we are investing as our own business in multiple pieces of harvesting equipment. And then really it's a way of letting farmers kind of share in that early, in the early risk of growing the crop, or having really Stony Creek Colors bear more of the risk of growing the crop and the farmer be able to learn what it takes to grow indigo. And hopefully as the model advances, be able to invest more specifically in their own farm and scale up the acres even more. I will kind of maybe show in a couple more slides, I think, but just to touch sort of on what the environmental and so like agronomic benefits of indigo as a rotation crop are. And I have grown a number of natural dye plants. There are a number of reasons why we're focused really on indigo as a plant. And I mean, truly the main one is that a huge amount of indigo is used every year, about 142 million pounds. Most of that is going into the denim industry. So it's definitely, in terms of thinking about natural dyes, it's the natural dye, it's the synthetic chemical used today that can actually be replaced with a natural colorant. And there are a lot of reasons why that hasn't happened yet. Not just because people haven't been investing in indigo, but also because we know that we're living in a very cheap carbon economy right now. But we really do feel very much like all of our initial data and early results of growing this crop now on hundreds of acres point to both the soil health benefit of growing it in rotation, as well as really this economic opportunity that it represents for farmers. So I mentioned already that it's a nitrogen fixing crop as a legume. It's also a very pest resistant crop. So the insects really don't want to eat the leaves of indigo. One of the chemical that is ultimately what we extract and then turn into indigo at our factory is thought to be turn into a gas in the stomach of bugs and kind of cause them to not want to eat any more of indigo leaves, kind of similar to the cyanogen pathway in some other plants. It's also a nematode suppressant crop, so that's really important for our long-term goal of potentially rotating with cotton ground, because nematodes are a huge problem in cotton and lots of other crops, so sweet potatoes, strawberries, soybeans, and so being able to put plants that are not going to host these nematodes and actually are going to resist them or decrease the populations is potentially a really important part of kind of as we're thinking about longer term integrated pest management below the kind of in the root zone. It's really important and promising. We've been working to transition a lot of our current contract farmers to growing the indigo in a no-till context or in a strip-till context, and have been finding success with that, really in terms of what it means for yields, but then also what that means for reducing the number of passes that a farmer makes in their field each season. And then that ties into the soil carbon conversation, definitely. I mean, it's about farming practices, and then for us, it's also about how are we growing plants that are going to be taking this carbon out of the atmosphere, and then what happens to that carbon. So we know that some of those leaves are brought to our facility. Then the stem and the roots are left behind, and because of our harvesting system, the leaves regrow again. So we're getting 3 or 4 harvests per season based on our harvesting method, depending on where we're growing the crop. In one of our more tropical research plots that we have as the business right now, we have actually estimating about 6 harvests per year. So really, like, this singular investment in a plant can get multiple levels of biomass. So that's going to be carbon and nitrogen from the atmosphere because it's a legume. So some of that plant material is then brought to our facility. We're extracting those leaves with our aqueous extraction system. And then that is, since they were just soaked in water, that's able to be really safely composted. And so we do manage our own compost facility that is taking this giant amount of biomass and turning it into something really useful. And then working right now with some local researchers to monitor, trying to assess how much carbon is returned to the soil. As I'm sure many of you know, it's really challenging and depends on so many aspects or factors. But right now, we're really at least at the point of saying, okay, we know on average the biomass per acre was this. This is how much was stem, root, leaves. This is how much biomass we pulled off. This is how much we estimate stayed in the field. Of that, this is what we think is returned fully to the soil, or this is what's kind of lost through the composting process. And in the long run, we actually really want to invest in an anaerobic digester for taking that biomass, and rather than just composting it, actually turning it into energy generation that would really help us kind of fully close the carbon loop. So I think I'm going over time. So Rebecca, just like shoot away.
We're there at time. Would it be okay if, yeah, go ahead. Do you want to?
Yeah, well, I'll just say, I mean, we sell our product to denim mills today. That was kind of my last bit on this carbon and soil piece, but today brands are really buying the finished dyed yardage from denim mills. So we don't necessarily have any direct contracts with brands whatsoever. And if we're thinking about really the kind of, this is a slide of our facility. We actually are operating right in a low-income census tract in Robertson County, Tennessee. So really believe in kind of the future of bringing back safe and clean chemical manufacturing to our neighborhoods. And I would just have this kind of last slide to say that there are still major challenges in scaling a business like ours. We've been able to scale because of R&D grant funding and because of investor equity. So we have a number of individuals or family offices or foundations and impact investors that have let us really build out this vision and taken a huge risk on us. And luckily, you know, we've had patents granted on our work, and we are really successful at doing what we're doing, but still always at the brink of how will we finance our next growing season? How will we finance our expansions? And because of some of the reasons mentioned earlier, you know, brands are not in the business of de-risking their supply chain. In fact, they're really in the business of pushing off the order and the buy for as long as possible. And so it presents a number of challenges for a company like ours, even with now a very proven ability to sell into global denim mills, whether in Europe or China or Mexico or the US, to actually, like, we're not lendable in a traditional banking context still. So while we give our farmers contracts that let them go out and get loans for just operating loans, they're not able to get loans to invest in equipment necessarily just on Stony Creek Colors contract if we're not able to go get those offtake agreements from brands themselves. So that's probably where I'll stop, but appreciate the opportunity to present this.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. Thank you to everyone. I'm going to just ask Sarah one last question, and then for time, the people who asked Q&A, we're going to address, I've typed in a lot of answers to your questions, and if you haven't seen an answer from me, I will put it into the email that Marisol and I send out. It has this recording, the resources associated with everyone here. You'll have contact information, their organizational affiliation. You'll be able to also continue any line of questioning directly with speakers via the email we send out. But I just want, Sarah, to your point of, and Nishant, you know, de-risking this system to meet the kinds of frameworks that Jeff and Gopal put forward, it really does rely on something kind of simple and relational, which is to get, you're giving the guarantees to the farmer. Nishant is giving, during lockdown, he's paying everyone full wages. Unlike in the free trade zones in Sri Lanka, where they just sent people home within a day without the end of the month's wages and without food. And Nishant has even pulled people off the highway and started hiring people who are trying to get back to their villages and paying people. And you're guaranteeing farmers per acre what they, you know, what that yield needs to be for them to survive, but you don't have anyone backing you up. So what I'm curious about is like, you know, we've talked about this but a little bit, but is there, do we want to throw out there like a couple of key messages for brands and designers, like get involved at the farm level? How do we develop a pre-competitive space maybe for people to start developing like a foundation, a brand-led foundation that guarantees loans? Mm-hmm. So if you're guaranteeing the farmers loans, who's guaranteeing you? Do we want to end on any kind of high note of like, we can do this?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to jump in on that a little bit because, you know, I think that one of the reasons I moved from this sort of study of natural resource management and policy and into sustainable ag space is because it's a huge opportunity. Like both of our farms, all of our, you know, a lot of land is involved in an economic pursuit, and it's a social pursuit, also an environmental pursuit, but ultimately it's we want to pay farmers to farm more responsibly, and the way to do that is with contracts and fair projections on what the future should look like. And I think that there is really a space needed, whether it's through foundations or through a group of brands coming together to say, we want these new, more innovative supply chain solutions to exist, but they're not always going to be able, they won't all be able to exist just on pure speculation by us as brands. It really needs to come in the form of purchase guarantees. And if it's too early for purchase guarantees, then some kind of coordinated collaboration that will let alternative sources of capital be leveraged. So whether that's traditional bank loans or whether that's like loan guarantees from a foundation, kind of under this broader rubric of how do we make regenerative agriculture and like sustainable textiles and fashion, how do we make the financing possible for that to exist? The benefit is it doesn't need to just be philanthropy. It could be a loan. It could be a low interest loan. It could be a high interest loan. Like I think that the things that we look at when we're not thinking about equity investment are usually high interest loans that are probably better than what most foundations are getting right now. And so it's like, how can we make this this happen in a more innovative and catalytic financing opportunity, I think.
So we're really ending here on the technical notes that we can do this. We need innovative financial instruments and relationship that are based in relationships with each other, supporting each other where there's need and meeting needs when there's a need. So Nishant, we'll do final words from, I know we're going to have 1 minute, final words of thanks and or comment, and then we will wrap up hopefully in like 1.5 minutes. So Nishant, we'll start with you and then we'll go Paul and Jeff.
Yeah, first of all, I would like to thank everyone for listening to me or having me on this. I would just like to say that it's really important to come together as a community. It is a crisis if you look at it as way, but it could be a solution if we come together and sort it out. And the most important thing is starting from, like, grounds up, being involved in each step of the supply chain, and also giving recognition to all the artisans and weavers and the farmers who put so much hard work. And a lot of the brands usually take away all the best part of this, and they get the credit for, hey, we've done this embroidery which is like being done for 50 hours or 100 hours, or the weaving for these many hours, or they don't credit the artisans or the companies or they work with. It's just the credit goes to the brand, which completely defies the purpose of community. And when you keep doing that, you sort of start losing the trade. The artisans start diminishing, the community start diminishing, because when you don't say it out loud, people don't know about it. And when people the artisans want more work, no one knows that these are the people who are doing it. So yeah, I would like to end on a note of working together and doing things in the right way.
Jeff, Gopal.
I'll just say very quickly, thank you so much for having me. And I would encourage folks to also see textiles and particularly on the manufacturing side as an opportunity to express principles of agroecology and solidarity with peasant social movements around the world, in addition to viewing it as its own sort of web of relationships, but also how that's nested in a larger set of relationships as well. In terms of, I'm just scanning some of the questions that people had, and I think a lot of them have to do with how folks engaged in this. I use supply chains only in relationship to industrial supply chains. Like the term chain here is the shackle, and so I think we should think about it in terms of what is the web of relationships in textile manufacturing versus the supply chain. That's reserved for industrial processes. But anyway, my point here is that there are a web of relationships that folks could be connecting with to broaden the intervention that you're making. So I'd encourage that. And thank you so much, Rebecca, for having me.
Thank you, Gopal. Web of relationships. Yes, nested in a bigger set of movements. Bigger movement. Jeff.
It's really wonderful to see this work, and thank you, Rebecca, for bringing us all together. It makes me very hopeful, actually, to see alternatives being constructed and implemented as we speak, and at this moment of deep crisis, to see that there are an awful lot of folks out there who understand really what's at the root and what the solutions are. So I leave this conversation with a great deal of hope, and thank you very much for that.
Thank you. Thank you all for extending your time today, those of you who stayed with us. I appreciate that. And Sarah, Nishant, Jeff, Gopal, brilliant. More soon. Oh, and Marisol is sharing with us the May 20th, Designing for Circularity and Biological Systems with the Biomimicry Institute and the Estuary Institute. July 15th, Deepening the Impact of Assessments Towards Social and Climate Goals. September 4th, September 16th, Understanding Our Role in Whole Systems. These are spaces and places to continue this conversation, both at the high level and technically, like we did today. Thank you all. Good day. Bye-bye.